Two attacks of violence hitting two American communities. Authorities just finished briefing the media following an attack on a synagogue in West Bloomfield, Michigan. What we know at this hour, a suspect rammed a truck into the doors of the building and drove down a hall into the facility. Security at the synagogue opened fire and the gunman was killed. That building is home to a school. No children or staff were injured. The FBI called it a, quote, targeted act of violence against the Jewish community. Moments ago, law enforcement said they're investigating why this happened.
All of us will work seamlessly together to get the answers, and then it will be called what it is. Obviously, it's a hateful, terrible thing, right? But what drove this person into action, that has to be determined by the investigation.
Also today in Norfolk, Virginia, one person was killed and two more injured in a shooting at Old Dominion University. The suspected gunman was a former National Guardsman who pled guilty to attempting to provide material support to ISIS in 2016. Investigators are calling this attack an act of terrorism. Police say the gunman is now dead. The FBI says a group of ROTC students, quote, terminated the threat. Let's bring in MS Now national security and intelligence analyst Michael Feinberg. He's a former assistant special agent in charge at the FBI. Michael, let's start where we ended, first with the shooting in Virginia. The suspect, again, a former National Guardsman, convicted in sympathizing with ISIS, released from prison December 2024. What has to happen with or at the FBI for something in response to something like this? What is your take on this? Particularly the note about the ROTC students is just gutting.
Yeah, first of all, my heart goes out to that entire community. As some viewers know, that was my last field office. I and my family lived there for quite some time, and I feel genuine and almost inarticulable sorrow for the students at ODU who had to deal with this today, and particularly those who were harmed and killed within this senseless act of terror and violence. And while these events are not predictable in terms of the particularities, they're foreseeable when you gut the domestic national security agencies' capabilities for dealing with terrorism, for dealing with foreign intelligence, in favor of politicized enforcement of immigration. The FBI has not received an increase in personnel or funding in quite some time. And at the start of this administration, a great many numbers of its investigative personnel were told that they will now be working immigration matters for 25 to 30% of the time. That, by definition, means that other things on which the Bureau was focused are going to fall through the cracks. And national security investigations, like counterterrorism investigations, are long-term, resource-intensive operations that require agents to constantly be meeting with sources, constantly be following leads, constantly be conducting surveillance. And if 2 out of 5 days of the work week, they're not allowed to do that, what do people like Kash Patel in the White House think is going to happen?
Michael, I want to, looking at both of these events, one where you have someone who's declared himself aligned or at least a follower influenced by ISIS. The other, we don't seemingly know much more about the individual. I guess that's still under investigation. But in one sense, these can be taken as isolated. One certainly having much more terrorist overtones to it, but the ramming of vehicles into this school, where at a synagogue involving students. What does that say? Is that a dot that's also connective tissue for investigation, or does the FBI sort of look back and see these as one is more related to terror, one not? What is that process? Because it really feeds into the point you're making about the level of skill that is brought to bear in situations like this so that there is clarity with respect to the type of an event we're talking about?
Yeah, so I imagine there is a lot of attempted dot connecting at the Hoover Building and in the Detroit Norfolk field offices right now, simply because it is potentially a coincidence that these both happened today, but it's an enormous coincidence. I can't think of any time, not just in my FBI career, but in my lifetime, where two similar horrible acts of violence occurred contemporaneously, at least not since 9/11. And it's suspect. But again, it's also foreseeable. The FBI, beginning on September 12th, 2001, chose to pivot. It was previously a reactive agency that investigated things after the fact. Robert Mueller made very clear to the nation and the workforce that that was no longer the case. If something happens, it's not the FBI's responsibility to investigate necessarily, but it's the FBI's responsibility to admit that in a certain sense they failed. And you're never going to stop everything. There's not a perfect filter. There's not a perfect bulwark against acts of violence and acts of terror. But it is just irresponsible and insulting to the citizens of this nation who rely upon these organizations to keep them safe, to move people away from what has always been their primary mission for the past 2.5 decades, to do something that is solely about scoring political points.